The year was 2018. Donald Trump, a businessman with no prior experience in government, had assumed the presidency of the United States. He promised to shake things up, to put America first, to bring back jobs. His methods: tariffs, trade wars, and massive economic stimulus. From the outset, economists and financial experts sounded a note of caution. Their worry? Inflation. Trump's signature economic policy, imposing hefty tariffs on goods imported from China and other countries, had the potential to ignite an inflationary spiral. The logic was straightforward. Tariffs make imports more expensive, forcing American businesses to raise prices for consumers. Simultaneously, Trump's tax cuts and spending sprees threatened to flood the economy with money, further fueling inflation. The Federal Reserve, tasked with keeping inflation in check, watched with growing concern. Would these policies lead to runaway inflation, eroding the purchasing power of American families and destabilizing the economy? Or would the economy adapt, absorbing the shocks without major disruptions? The answer, as is often the case in economics, was complex and multifaceted. For more insights like these, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. To understand the potential impact of Trump's tariffs, it's essential to grasp how they work. In essence, a tariff is a tax imposed on goods imported from another country. Imagine, for example, that the US imposes a 25% tariff on cars imported from Japan. This means that an American car dealership importing a Japanese car worth $20,000 would have to pay an additional $5,000 in taxes. This added cost is then passed down the supply chain. The importer, in this case, the car dealership, would likely raise the price of the Japanese car to cover the cost of the tariff. Consumers, in turn, would face higher prices for Japanese cars. The goal of a tariff is often to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. By making imported goods more expensive, tariffs can make domestically produced goods more appealing to consumers. However, tariffs come with a cost. They can lead to higher prices for consumers, reduce consumer choices, and spark retaliatory tariffs from other countries, hurting businesses that export goods. In the case of Trump's tariffs, the concern was that these costs would outweigh any potential benefits, leading to a net negative impact on the U.S. economy. Trump's economic policies presented a double whammy in terms of inflation risk. On one hand, his tariffs threatened to directly increase the cost of imported goods, fueling price hikes for consumers. On the other hand, his tax cuts and increased government spending, while intended to stimulate economic growth, carried the risk of overheating the economy. Economic stimulus, in simple terms, is like stepping on the gas pedal of the economy. When the government cuts taxes, people have more money in their pockets to spend or invest. Similarly, increased government spending injects money into the economy. This increased demand, if not matched by an increase in supply, can lead to higher prices. Think of it like this. If everyone has more money to spend but the same number of goods and services are available, businesses can raise prices, knowing that consumers are willing to pay more. The combination of tariffs and economic stimulus created a perfect storm for inflation. Tariffs threatened to push prices up from one direction, while stimulus threatened to pull them up from the other. The question was, how much would prices rise, and would the Fed be able to keep inflation in check? As Trump's policies began to take effect, there were early signs that inflation might be brewing. Stock markets, often seen as barometers of economic sentiment, experienced periods of volatility as investors grappled with the potential impact of trade wars and rising prices. Meanwhile, data began to trickle in, suggesting that tariffs were indeed pushing up prices for businesses and consumers. A study by economists at Princeton University and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimated that Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods imposed through late 2018 were costing American consumers and businesses billions of dollars each month in the form of higher prices. The Federal Reserve, true to its mandate, began to raise interest rates in an attempt to cool down the economy and keep inflation in check. Raising interest rates makes it more expensive to borrow money, which can slow down economic growth and, in theory, keep a lid on inflation. However, the Fed faced a delicate balancing act. Raise rates too quickly, and they risked triggering a recession. Raise rates too slowly, and inflation might spiral out of control. Section 5. The pandemic intervenes, a shifting landscape. Just as the economic impact of Trump's policies began to fully unfold, the world was hit by an unprecedented event. The COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic upended global supply chains, shut down businesses, and threw millions into unemployment. The economic fallout was swift and severe, plunging the world into a recession. The pandemic also had a profound impact on inflation, but not in the way many had anticipated. Instead of runaway inflation, the initial impact of the pandemic was deflationary. With businesses shuttered and people confined to their homes, demand plummeted, leading to falling prices. Suddenly, the immediate concern was not inflation but deflation, a sustained decrease in the general price level of goods and services. The Federal Reserve responded aggressively, slashing interest rates to near zero and injecting trillions of dollars into the financial system to prevent a complete economic collapse. The government, under both the Trump and Biden administrations, also unleashed massive spending programs to support businesses and individuals during the crisis. Section 6. Post-pandemic realities. Inflation bites hard. As the pandemic eased and economies began to reopen, a different kind of inflationary beast emerged. Supply chains, already strained by the pandemic, struggled to keep up with resurgent demand. Consumers, flush with savings accumulated during lockdowns and buoyed by government stimulus, went on a spending spree, further fueling demand. This confluence of factors, supply chain disruptions, pent-up demand, and government stimulus, created the perfect storm for inflation. Prices for everything from cars and lumber to food and energy began to surge. By the summer of 2021, inflation in the United States had reached its highest level in over 3 decades. The Federal Reserve, initially slow to react, finally acknowledged that inflation was not transitory as they had initially claimed. They began raising interest rates aggressively in an attempt to tamp down demand and rein in inflation. The Biden administration, facing mounting political pressure over rising prices, took steps to address supply chain bottlenecks and release strategic oil reserves to ease energy prices. Section 7. A new administration, a different approach. With the inauguration of President Joe Biden in January 2021, the United States embarked on a different economic path. While Biden largely maintained the tariffs imposed by his predecessor, his approach to trade policy was more multilateral, focused on working with allies to address China's trade practices. Biden also shifted the focus of economic policy from tax cuts and deregulation, which had defined the Trump era, to government investment in infrastructure, clean energy, and social programs. His signature legislative achievement, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, included provisions aimed at combating climate change, lowering healthcare costs, and reducing the deficit. The impact of these policy shifts on inflation is still being debated. Proponents of Biden's approach argue that investments in clean energy and infrastructure will eventually ease inflationary pressures by boosting productivity and reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Critics, however, contend that increased government spending will only fuel inflation in the near term. Section 8. Lingering effects and uncertain futures. As of early 2025, the U.S. economy finds itself at a crossroads. Inflation, while down from its peak, remains stubbornly high. The Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes have slowed economic growth, raising fears of a recession. The global economic outlook remains uncertain, clouded by the ongoing war in Ukraine, geopolitical tensions, and the lingering effects of the pandemic. The legacy of Trump's tariffs is still being felt. While some argue that the tariffs achieved their goal of protecting American jobs and industries, others contend that they simply raised costs for businesses and consumers, contributing to inflation. The Biden administration has been hesitant to lift the tariffs, fearing political backlash and hoping to use them as leverage in trade negotiations with China. The debate over the root causes of inflation and the best policy responses continues. Some economists argue that supply chain disruptions and other pandemic-related factors are primarily to blame, while others point to excessive government spending as the main culprit. The Federal Reserve's ability to engineer a soft landing slowing inflation without triggering a recession remains an open question. Section 9. Conclusion, a cautionary tale. The story of inflation in the Trump and Biden years serves as a cautionary tale about the complex interplay of economic policies, global events, and unforeseen shocks. Trump's tariffs, intended to protect American jobs and industries, ultimately contributed to rising prices, as did his tax cuts and spending increases. The COVID-19 pandemic, an event no one could have predicted, upended the economic calculus, initially leading to deflation and then, as the economy recovered, to a surge in inflation. The Federal Reserve's response, while necessary to prevent a complete economic collapse, also contributed to inflationary pressures. As we move forward, it remains to be seen how the lingering effects of these policies and events will continue to shape the economic landscape. One thing is certain, the fight against inflation is far from over, and the stakes for American families and businesses remain high.